Horror movies have shown us that time and time again that the fear of dolls is more than understandable. The permanent grin on their faces, the soullessness of their eyes, and even the possibility of being possessed by a demonic entity. Hi, I'm Paul Holstein, and I'm going to be reading to you guys the story of my little doll on this episode of Poltergeist Frights. I love collecting dolls. Baby dolls, porcelain dolls, rag dolls. There's something about how unique they are to each other, but at the same time are similar in miraculous ways. The one thing I loved about them are the eyes. People say they're lifeless and creepy, but I looked at it like they were all hiding something behind them, like an exciting mystery just waiting to be solved. My dad always came home with a new friend for my collection. However, there was a day that was different. When he came home, he was carrying a box with the words, "Take good care of him," and gave it to me, saying he found it at a yard sale for free. I opened the box, revealing a Victorian doll with the features of a little boy, with red dimples and a wide smile that went from cheek to cheek. I took him out of his box, and suddenly a wave of absolute love came over me. He was the most beautiful thing I have ever laid eyes on. He was my little doll. I cradled him into my arms like a mother would with her child. I did everything I could to make him feel at home. He was part of the family. I fed him, played games with him, and I sang to him until he fell asleep. It was like I knew what he needed, as if he were a living being. My parents didn't think anything of it. I was just a little girl playing with a new toy. I was more than playing. I was completely obsessed with the little Victorian doll. We were absolutely inseparable, and whenever someone tried to get us apart, I would scream and cry until we were reunited. I took him everywhere with me, from the dinner table all the way to school. The kids would bully me, but it wouldn't bother me, because somehow I knew that my doll loved me, and that was all that mattered. It was all just innocent fun when I was a little girl at least, but that changed when I stopped playing. When I got older and was starting middle school, I started growing out of dolls, but for some reason I still had a deep connection with the little Victorian doll, but it got weaker through the years, or so I thought. One night my parents were both out of the house, leaving me alone for the night. I was relaxing, eating popcorn and watching TV in the living room when I started hearing a faint sound like a baby crying. I looked around and didn't see anything out of the ordinary, so I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I turned up the volume, and as I did so, the crying turned into shrill screaming, and I found myself covering my ears. I turned off the TV and tried to escape into my room. When I entered my room, the crying suddenly stopped, and the first thing I saw was the little doll on the shelf with a plastic bottle and wet stains across the face like he was crying, even though his smile was still as wide as a Cheshire cat. I started having a feeling of unease, asking myself what I just experienced. My body seemed to move on its own as I found myself grabbing the bottle and feeding the little Victorian boy. And I could have sworn to hear someone say, "Thank you, Mother." I didn't tell my parents about the incident. They would have thought I was crazy. I probably was. Who else would possibly consider the fact that an inanimate object was screaming at them from inside their head? I tried forgetting what occurred that night, but every time I went into my room, I would look at the doll, expecting more voices or even movements. Every time I checked, his face still had the red dimples and wide smile, and I could have sworn that those soulless eyes were staring right at me, glad to see me. I wanted to get him off my shelf and get him out of my sight, but it was like some sort of force was telling my body to not even try it. This time, though, I was able to force myself to approach the doll. My legs felt heavier with each step as I got closer. Eventually, I did get to the doll's shelf and I began to remove him. I looked into those soulless eyes before I approached my closet to hide him from my gaze for good, plopped him in, and slowly shut the door, looking through the shrinking cracks to make sure the doll stayed. After the door was shut, I started to feel immense relief. Unfortunately, that feeling didn't last long. As a short time after the door went click, I started to hear child laughter echoing around my room. I turned around, trying to figure out where the laughter was coming from, when I saw something that filled my body with paralyzing terror. My little doll was on the bed, the smile turned into a frown. I still heard the laughter around me, transitioning from innocent to maniacal. I suddenly felt a stinging pain on my hands. They felt like they were on fire. I raised them up to my face and saw large, black boils growing on the skin. The laughter was getting louder. This must have been some mean joke to the doll because the smile suddenly returned. However, this smile looked different. It didn't look like it was painted on. More like a smile with intention. A sinister smile. The laughter was getting too much, and my hands hurt too much to cover my ears, so I ended up screaming at the top of my lungs, begging it to stop. My dad bolted into the room, seeing me on the floor like the little girl I once was. He crouched down to me and asked me what was wrong, and I was about to open my mouth to answer, but his next question shook me. "Did something happen to your doll?" I looked down at my arms and discovered that I had the doll cradled in my arms. His artificial smile returned, and the boils gone. I threw it away from me and pushed my back against the closet door to attempt to add more distance as my dad looked with both confusion and concern. I looked at my dad and begged him to get rid of it. His concerned look grew and tried to ask why I was acting this way, though when he saw tears flowing out of my eyes, he didn't ask any more questions and picked up the doll. I started to hear faint crying, knowing full well that it was coming from the doll. Despite that, I was relieved. I was not going to be tortured by it anymore. Or so I thought. A few days went by since my dad got the doll out of our house, and everything was perfectly quiet. There was no crying, no child laughter, and no black boils suddenly appearing on my skin. I was able to enter my room without worrying about finding a plastered smile with soulless eyes looking back at me. My parents were planning on going out again, leaving me home alone once more. They offered to stay with me just in case another breakdown happened, but I assured them that I would be fine. I stayed up late, watching all the late night shows on the TV to the point where it felt like the whole world around me had disappeared. However, I came back to reality when I noticed a shadow fly across the screen, looking around to see if anything fell over. I started feeling a familiar pain on my hands, and I looked down to see that the boils were growing again, quicker and bigger. My worst fear was realized when I once again heard the laughter and saw a strange light coming through my room. I got up from the couch and walked slowly towards the glow that was sticking out of my door, winching with pain from the boils. I entered my room, the light practically blinding me when I got closer. The light faded, revealing something that almost made me too terrified to feel the boils pushing through my skin. The dolls I had as a kid were everywhere, ripped to shreds. Piles of stuffing littered the ground. Some of the baby dolls were being hung from the ceiling. A red liquid resembling blood was dripping from their eyes and mouth. A sound of agonizing crying and screaming entered my mind. The toys were being tortured, and they wanted their suffering to end. And then I saw him, my little doll on his shelf, looking at me straight in the eyes. His red dimples faded, his smile now a scowl, and his eyes were different. They were no longer the soulless eyes that he usually had. They looked at me in rage. The boils were spreading all across my body. The words, Play with me, Mommy, were now invading my head. I collapsed to my knees in pain, but my eyes were still on the creature disguised as a doll. His smile was back, but wider and now more sinister. The boils were beginning to grow the size of tennis balls. I felt like I was going to explode any moment. The doll was enjoying what he was seeing. Play with me, Mommy, soon turned into Mommy's gonna die in a teasing tone in my head. However, I heard another set of voices, encouraging voices, telling me, "Don't quit! Get him!" It was the tortured dolls were easing me on, the same dolls I loved for years as a child. From that moment, I forced myself up, telling myself to ignore the pain, that the doll had no control over me. I ran towards the doll with all my strength, and I grabbed the invader by his smiling face. I could hear the doll's shrill screams bursting in my head. I aimed his face and smashed it against the shelf, again and again, each one harder than the last. "Stop, Mother!" was now in my head, but each smack made the voices weaker. The light was getting brighter, and the cracks started to show on his head. I raised my little doll up and hit his head one last time, as hard as I possibly could, and the light flashed a bright, blinding blow. The doll's screaming and begging now faded into absolute silence. When my eyes were able to see again, everything that was in my room was gone. The hanging baby dolls, the stuffing, and even the large boils had vanished. I looked in my hand. My little doll was shattered. No red dimples, no wide Cheshire smile, and no soulless eyes looking back at me. I plopped on my bed, exhausted from the encounter with the little Victorian doll. I heard the sound of tires on our driveway. My dad has returned from work, so I exited my room so that I could greet him. Before he could even set his foot on the door, I ran to him and gave him a great big hug. He didn't hug me back. Instead, he shoved a big gift box into my arms. I was confused as I started to open it. Then I looked inside. My heart dropped as inside the box was a doll that looked like my father. A doll with a look of fear on his face. I looked up at the face of the man that gave me the box. A wide smile was across his face. His eyes had no soul when I looked into them. And ladies and gentlemen, that is it for My Little Doll. I hope you have all enjoyed listening to this story. And I hope you will stay tuned for tomorrow, because tomorrow is actually a personal favorite of mine this season called Spilt Coffee. So I hope you stay tuned for that. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, I am Paul Holstein, and this has been Poltergeist Frights. Thank you for listening.